All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Hello to the folks in the chat. Um, Looking forward to this myself. So today we are welcoming back to the show Lara Sheehi. We had a recent conversation. Well, it's not that recent now, but um, back in I think late October with her and Steven, her partner, about, well, it was just really kind of reflecting on the early days now of what has become um, a very long, you know, conflict, genocidal war, resistance, all of the above, right? Going on in Palestine. And so she reached out to me, I think last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, to say, let's have a conversation about mental health. And so I'm very grateful for that. Hope folks will join. Tell folks, make sure you like, subscribe, share, support on Patreon. Um, and get folks in here, because hopefully we can also take some conversations from the audience. We have a few things that we want to go over, but we want this to be a space that folks can engage and bring up things that they want to talk about as well. So um, let me just read Lara's introduction real quick. So Lara Sheehi is an assistant professor of clinical psychology. She got her doctorate of psychology from George Washington University's professional psychology program, where she also taught doctoral level students and was the faculty director of the Psychoanalysis and Arab World Lab. Lara's work takes up decolonial and anti-oppressive approaches to psychoanalysis with a focus on liberation struggles in the global South. She is the co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. Lara is the author of the forthcoming book, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, which will be out next year. I can't believe 2025 is next year, on Pluto Press. So, Laura, always great to have you. Welcome back to the show.
So good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Lara. So just to start, like, I would love for you to just kind of, because you reached out to me to sort of, bring this idea forward, and I'm really glad that you did. But I'm interested also because I often initiate, these sort of, and so I know why I'm asking people to come on. But I would love for you to say a little bit about why you were like, let's do this now. It's important. And also, yeah, I've already said, we want folks to engage here, but let's just start there and talk to you a little bit about what motivated you to bring this idea for the discussion.
Yeah. Well, part of it is you're a comrade, right? And I think these conversations are ongoing. And so our last live conversation was in October, and we were just saying that pre-show about how it feels like time has collapsed. But I mean that, like, I like spending time with you. You're a comrade, and I listen to your show all the time. But I think part of it is being in community, and I'm a practicing clinician, and so I see folks regularly, but I also have folks reach out to me, and there's a way in which people are taking in everything that's happening, and there's a commitment I have to despecializing our knowledge. Like I've said this to you before, that it's very much in Che's tradition of despecializing medicine. What does it mean to have these conversations in public, to say the things that so many of us might be thinking by ourselves in isolation? And what does that mean politically to do that, right? What does it mean as a clinician to come and say, hey, part of my training has been distilling this knowledge. And what does it mean for us then as comrades who have political alignments to come together and say publicly, let's speak to these things. Let's practice a discourse, right? And when we were coming up with a title, like, what do we even call this, right? There's so much that we're all feeling, right? There's so much affect. Obviously, part of that is having a genocide be you broadcast live and recognizing and reckoning with the violence of people having to smuggle out their stories to us, and 5 months of this, and feeling the utter failures of every system we've been indoctrinated to believe in, right? And even those of us who have political commitments that critique these systems, we've been finding out, and this is from conversations with people, about like the affective investments we might still have in these systems. And what does it mean to confront that? And what does it mean to feel that everything that you were taught to believe, even in your critical leftist positions, that we get pulled in, we get conscripted into this? And what does it mean to sort of attend to that at the same time as committing ourselves to liberation? And so I hear people being tired. I hear people, asking, searching for how do we sustain. Sometimes they call it hope, right? And I hear this on the couch, so to speak, and on the street, that people will say, how do we do this? And so for me, it's been really important to say, okay, how do we disrupt colonial logics? And I mean this in as much as like colonial logics of isolation. If I'm talking from a Fanonian perspective, I'm saying, how do we sustain disalienation? How do we do that? And I don't believe we can do that in isolation. And so what better way of like fulfilling my duty? We had talked about this in Arabic. There's a word, wajib. And it comes with a political commitment, has wajib. And the best way to translate that is duty, even though that doesn't really cut it. But there's a duty I feel to say, okay, if this is a quote unquote expertise I have, how does one disseminate that as a political project, right? For us to be able to say and come together and live, whether it's take questions or sort of talk about these things or share what has lodged inside of us over these months, and do that in service of disalienation, do that in service of a larger liberatory project, do that in service of destabilization. Because the final piece that I'll say is that I'm feeling an urgency for this, because I can see the ways that there are stabilizing efforts that are happening, and they're being done in the name of mental health as well, right? And so let me be specific about what I mean about that is mental health is a central part of this. It always has been, but maybe we've been better at sort of discussing the psychic wear and tear that comes in living in a violently capitalist, cis heteronormative, racist world, right? We speak about the psychic toll that takes. And the psychic toll of witnessing violence, that's such unvarnished violence that acts with impunity, right? But I think there's also something about that ends up feeling like we are entirely disconnected in even approaching that. Right. And even approaching that and understanding it. And this is the destabilized. So then you have pop psychology or elements of mental health. Like some of the people watching or listening may have, witnessed the falling out of Brene Brown, who's like a darling of psychology, and the ways in which mental health efforts have always worked with the state. I mean, this is Fanon's sort of idea 101, is you become arms of the state. But I'm always fascinated with the ways in which mental health language and discourse works to stabilize violence. And that is the discourse I am very much worried. I hear it happening where people are sort of rushing in and prescribing certain things that are completely disconnected from the political element of it. And mental health can become depoliticized. In fact, it's at its most potent in terms of a weapon of the state and a weapon of oppression when it's completely depoliticized, completely defanged of its importance. And that's, I think, the urgency I'm feeling. And so who better to do that with than my comrade and the platform that you've really done so much labor to create for all of us, really.
Well, much appreciated, and certainly no one I'd rather have this conversation with than you. I think so. There's a term that you use in this title too of resisting psychic intrusion. Could you just say a little bit about what does that term mean? I think I've seen it. I was looking it up and I found it in paper. I think that you and Stephen maybe wrote at one point. But yeah, if you could say a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, of course. In the most basic sense, what we sort of think about that in terms of the book that we wrote, but then the ways that we've been thinking through this are the ways that systems of oppression come to live inside of us and intrude. They invade the psychic province, meaning that they can be very crude, right? In, like, let's say the surveillance state, where we find ourselves disciplining ourselves because internally we're like, oh shit, who's watching this, who's tracking me, that's a psychic intrusion. And then there are all these ways that psychic intrusion happens through ideology and social practices that we might not even be aware of. In the context of what's happening in Palestine, some of the psychic intrusions are 100% state propaganda, right? And they work on our emotions and our internal world and have several potential outcomes. What I'm most worried about is people losing the urgency, is people believing the state propaganda. I hear this a lot where folks are like, nothing's happening, right? Where they're like, what's the point of us being in the streets? Nothing's happening. Look at what's happening here. Look at what's happening here. And on the one hand, I want to be fair and attend to the fact that people are responding to unmetabolizable, right, levels of violence that when you are reared in a world that tells you there are checks and balances to injustice. Now, many of us who are people of colonized countries and racialized subjects can be like, haha, yeah, what world do you live in where things include justice? But part of the way these systems of oppression work is they have to, on some level, show a semblance of that. Otherwise, people en masse might disidentify from them. So on some, that is where the psychic intrusion comes in, is that systems of power and oppression working themselves into our internal world and having us sort of identify with issues of fairness, issue of that there is something that will stop a state in some ways, that settler colonial violence can be reasoned with, reckoned with, all these, that is also a psychic intrusion, right? And I think that there are actual concrete ways that works, right? When we see state propaganda being blasted over and over and over, I think people start to feel what they characterize as, to me, is helpless. Like, what is the point? I cannot do anything in the face of all of this. And my concern is when we attach readily to those psychic intrusions, we're also missing all the material aspects of what is actually shifting and why the state has to work so hard to make those psychic intrusions, like, right, they sort of rivet up their absurdity, the contradictions, the things that we might see. So the most recent of which, actually, somebody on the couch shared this with me, that there's state propaganda from the state now known as Israel saying that there were kids involved in October 7th attack. And that sort of, when you hear that, the level of absurdity stops you in your tracks. And some might say it's laughably obvious what the state is trying to do, to say that somehow there are kid militants and that is why we need to be murdering, right, upwards of 10,000 children and sniping them in the head. And so we can be like, are you kidding me, right? But what I'm really attuned to when I talk about psychic intrusions is, what is the sort of unconscious and sometimes conscious staying effect that has on us when we might think twice without noticing about what we say, about what we share, about even the arguments we have to make, right? It puts us in a position where we might lose the political militancy we need to be clear on what is happening, to be clear on our analysis, to be clear that these are purposeful. In our last conversation, we were calling them psyops, right? They're psychological operations. And we need to name these things out loud. And we need to understand all the ways in which psychological operations work. And some of those are just working on the things that already live within us as people who have been reared in this world, right? With the prominence and hegemony of oppressive systems that really confuse us even when we're not confused, right? And so there is this what you and me are doing, and I will speak for myself, maybe what I do when I speak out loud and name the things that abusers want you to keep silent is also giving us, languaging something is giving us something to constantly know and stay in alignment with political and material realities. And that's a psychological, that's just a like psychological intervention, you know?
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. And I'm gonna play a clip actually that I thought of as you were talking about that. That was not one that I showed you
Okay.
beforehand, but it's something that made me think about this because we've been doing a lot of work recently on counterinsurgency. And I think there are ways in which, when you look at what's going on in the Palestinian context, it doesn't make a lot of sense within the framework of U.S. counterinsurgency, because U.S. counterinsurgency um, is more interested in the population. It's more interested in trying to isolate the militants or the insurgents, right, from the rest of the population, which obviously Israel does do some of that through the way that it sort of is like, condemn the terrorists, turn them in, etc., and then we'll stop killing you all. But like the level of violence that Israel is willing to enact through their version of counterinsurgency doctrine
Mhm.
um, it clashes with the way U.S. doctrine is articulated publicly, at least. But on the flip side of that, what I wanted to bring up is narrative, which is something I want to talk with you a bit about in different ways, because I've been reading counterinsurgency doctrine and before that reading Sylvia Wynter, and both of them are very interested in narrative. Um, and so I'm going to play this clip, and I think it very much relates to what you were just talking about. And so I'll just play it and then we can talk about it a
Sure.
little bit. So, all right. All right, let's see now. All right, folks, make sure to tell me if you can hear this in the chat.
Last question. As you said repeatedly, the U.S. chose to be cautious as
Can
it
you hear it,
suspended
Laura?
funding to
I
UNRWA
can.
for allegations that 12 of its 30,000-person staff, may have been involved in the atrocities on October 7th. And as you described yesterday, that's kind of standard U.S. policy to have this type of caution with all sorts of entities. But as our colleagues have asked you over the past few months, there have been broad and specific human rights violations that we've been concerned about: human attacks against hospitals and churches, targeting people with white flags, both Israeli hostages and Palestinians, torturing Palestinians, and now, of course, this attack on Henry Rajab's family and then leaving her to die horribly. And so I'm wondering, on all this, you've said we're looking into it and Israel is investigating, but in each of these cases, the U.S. doesn't seem to be as cautious with its money and support as it is with UNRWA. It's to the point that the ICJ and the U.S. court both say Israel may be plausibly committing genocide. Still, U.S. money is coming, while the U.S. shut off UNRWA funding immediately. So I'm just wondering if you could explain that sort of difference.
Let me say there is, I think, a false equivalency embedded in that question between members of a terrorist organization who went out and intentionally killed innocent civilians.
Right.
That is the difference. When you have members of Hamas who participated in October 7th, according to the allegations made by the government of Israel, that I should say UNRWA itself found credible. Those are allegations that UNRWA found credible of people intentionally participating in a terrorist action to murder civilians. That is different than a military campaign conducted in an environment where that terrorist organization hides behind human shields. And so we will continue to engage with the government of Israel about how to minimize civilian casualties. There have been far too many over the course of this campaign, and how to prevent civilians from being killed. But I think they are very different matters for the reasons I just articulated. Let me go ahead.
So, first, I just want to say, like, this is, I mean, talk about psychological warfare, right? Like,
Yes.
this is, I mean, one, like, if you take sort of everything that he says at its face, then it's a doctrine that says that terrorism is worse than genocide, right? Like it actually says that like what has been articulated as genocide and human rights, crimes against humanity, etc., within international law, which I know we could all talk about how useless that is, but it's a thing, right? And so that's basically saying that none of that is as important as so-called terrorism, which of course is a designation that states can just make. It's not, there's, a state defines what terrorism is, right? And so I mean it's essentially like a total logic of fascism. I mean it anyway.
Yes.
We were talking even in our group about this week about how there's two separate things I think that we could say, which is one, on the one end, that the Zionist entity, so-called Israel, has probably never faced as strong of a, it's probably never been so delegitimized on an international level
Mm-hmm.
than it is currently.
Mm-hmm.
So many more people understand it now
Mm-hmm.
as an illegitimate project
Mm-hmm.
than did prior to October 7th. And on the flip side, there's also what we are being primed to accept and normalize
Yes.
and rewrite in terms of international rules of engagement and
Yes.
law, etc. And those things are, totally upside
Right.
down and opposite of each other. So anyways, I don't know if you have reaction to that, but as you were saying what you said before, that was the clip that came to my mind.
Well, do I ever? So, because I watch these with an eye of what's happening psychologically, right? And psychologically, I mean, I'm not interested in these sort of reductionistic and readings of the mind of, so and so, or the mind of a state. And usually, and the reason why I will say that is because they've been appropriated and used against the wrong people. If we start doing this sort of like, we've seen better way of saying this. We've seen the ways in which the mind of the Muslim has been psychoanalyzed or psychologized. And so I move away from that and instead read process and logic. And that is where, that is what I'm interested in when you and I do this, or do this live and watch this video, is to regularize a discourse that speaks against a particular logic of state making and subject making that has always been around. And so I will say what I'll say first before we go into this clip as a case example, right? Is that psychologists have always been involved in state-making efforts. They have always been involved in that because there is an understanding by power, and by fascists, of course, about the power of intruding into the psychic province. And that's why, by the way, psychologists were involved in torture in Guantanamo Bay. They were intimately involved, and there had to be an entire internal organizing against military psychologists in the American Psychological Association to say that psychologists cannot be at black sites. You cannot be involved in torture. Now, our ethical code should be enough to tell you that is like fundamentally a torture site is one that cannot uphold our ethical principles of first do no harm. I don't care what discourse you have about I'm there to oversee and make sure that this torture is not enough. There's a fundamental, right? It doesn't add up. So that needs to be our starting point. Our starting point can't be to lessen the violence done in these sites. It needs to be that we cannot be part of these. And that needs to be our position because we have a duty to protect and a duty to do no harm. So that's number one. But this is not new. Psychologists have always been part of this. The state of Israel funds a project called Project Butterfly. That's all about psychological operations. And part of that is these smear campaigns that we see. There's some forensic journalism that's now come out post October 7th around how much money goes into these smear campaigns as part of a psychological warfare. And it's explicit, right? This sort of firm that the state hires is explicit in talking about psychological operations as being central to the work of state propaganda. So I'm a critic of our field. My scholarship is about being a critic of the oppressive ways that psychology is used. And so this is very helpful for me to just state, we need to just acknowledge that and understand that behind every state, there are psychologists that are sort of manufacturing this together because we understand the power of affect, the power of psychology in both inviting people into state power and also in stabilizing these insurgencies that we see. So when you play a video like this, and I'm so glad you did this and didn't show me before, because I want us, like, part of this is to practice how one reads these. Otherwise you watch this and you just want to like tear your hair out. You're just like, how? So many people ask me, how do these people lie so blatantly and just don't even blink, right? Is there sociopathy involved in that? I mean, we can say there is, in any terms of like unbridled power, there's a sociopathic impulse. And also I worry that, again, going down the realm of psychologizing means also that we are saying there is a psychological fix to these things, rather than reading it as an ideological formation that actually needs dismantling, right? Not fixing, not reform, not all these sorts of things. Because what happened in that clip is classically a psychic inversion, right? This person lays out, and he turns it around, and with practiced affect, look at the way he's even using his hands, and that is us to read. This is rehearsed sound bites that have a very specific actual reason why they're said like that, where they come inside of us, because the impulse is, how do I even argue with that? Because everything then becomes a deflection, right? Everything becomes a deflection about, but wait a second, but they are doing this. And then they've already done the job of destabilizing. The focal point of that argument is that you are aiding a genocide. And we are seeing this up front. And how do you actually, in bold-faced, right, hypocrisy, support this? And then he does this psychic inversion, and he goes, there's a difference, right, between a terrorist organization and a state. Which, why calling it a psychic inversion? Because that's the argument, actually. There's a difference between a state enacting this, but he turns it around and uses it actually as a way to support why Israel or the United States should be actually behind genocide, and just making sure that we don't use excessive force, right? After upwards of 20,000 people have already been murdered. I want to say one last thing. These statements, like human shields, right? Of course they're Islamophobic. Of course they're tried and tested. And of course they are what we'd expect from a state that is supporting a genocide. What I also want to say is they live inside people, and they have affective charge, and they're connected to a series of associations where you just need to say that. And nobody's going to think, an old white grandmother in suburbia is the one who's holding, right, the human shields. That is what I mean about these psychic intrusions that play on tropes that are not just, right, racist tropes or ideological, but that live inside of us and have been practiced over and over and over again, especially post 9/11 in the United States, that you say one thing and racism and sexism and Islamophobia does the work itself. You actually power doesn't have to be as crude as a genocide. It can just activate something and people will go with it. What is fascinating to me is that, I always say this, is that state power, and especially as it's consolidated in the Zionist state, is a walking projection machine. Because what we saw several weeks ago was a video, right, of Israeli military, right, their occupation forces, that's why I'm saying military, their occupation forces, dressed up as human shields in a hospital and assassinating patients. So I also want us to read any one of this discourse, not just as maddening to us, right? But also as confessions of what they know is actually doable. Everything they say is used tenfold, right? Because that's how power works. But if you connect it associatively and psychologically, it then stops us all in our tracks. And it's supposed to make us horrified in particular ways. That's on purpose. That's a psyops.
Yeah. No, that's great. I appreciate all of that. And thank you. Where to go from here? I mean, one things that I'll bring up that's just an interesting thing. This is just sort of my little therapy moment here on this, because like, so just a background for folks on me, like I grew up in the United Church of Christ, which is an interesting denomination. It's one of the more progressive denominations in the United States. Is one of the few that has a pretty strong stance in favor of Palestine right now, for instance, even though I'm no longer, you know, I haven't been to church in a very long time, at least, you know, as a, you know, maybe I'll go on Christmas with my family, that kind of thing. But so, you know, I think of myself at this point of agnostic, but even within that tradition, like one of the things about it as a kid is you know, there was no discussion of hell ever within that denomination. And my parents were always sort of like, you know, they didn't believe in hell, and they were all, there was also an ambivalence about heaven, like about the afterlife and that sort of stuff. And even an ambivalence about physical resurrection, which is, you know, it is not usually something that Christians are ambivalent about. But the point of all that was to say that it had a fairly progressive, even utopian, like political horizon, though. And what's interesting is, like, I used to go to my friends' churches sometimes as a kid, like, you know, on a Sunday, and they'd be talking about, oh, you don't do this, you're going to go to hell, you're going to burn forever. Like, and this was like in Sunday school. I'm like, I'm 6. Like, what are you thinking? You know? And so I remember that always as like a disconnect and a source of like arguments from even a young age. So I say that to say, like, the concept of hell has always been something that I resisted as an idea, and that I, you know, it didn't align with my worldview or my political horizon, even like kind of organically. Um, and yet, since the genocide has happened, there has been a strong anger and impulse in me to say, I hope that there's a hell, even if it means I have to go there too, so that I can see the consequences for the people who are doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, this also, like, folks know me that I've, you know, done a lot of work on prison abolition. I'm a strong believer in redemption. I work with political prisoners who are accused of, you know, and convicted of serious, you know, criminal offenses, trying to get them out through parole and so on. And so, like, you know, in some ways, this clashes with a lot of, you know, my politics, my values. But also there's a thing in it that I'm very skeptical of as a psychological impulse too, because it's like it also reinforces something that you mentioned a little bit earlier on, of like a sort of belief that we can't do something about this, and so I need someone else to do it. I need something greater, and I can tell that it is not any of the forces of geopolitics or you know, the UN or the ICJ. Even as I appreciate and, you know, support like what South Africa is doing in the ICJ, you know, that obviously, I mean, the I'm inspired by the resistance. I'm inspired by the responses of like what Ansar Allah and what Hezbollah have done to try to put more pressure in material ways upon the Zionist entity to cease what they're doing. But still in my mind, it goes back to this thing of like, I need somebody else to intervene. I need divine intervention here, and so I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it's very interesting because I guess the other thing I would say is it ties into this thing of master narratives, right? Because this is also something that is deeply culturally, embedded within all of us in the West. Even if you're not Christian, you're embedded in societies that, even the secular is sort of is an invention, as Sylvia
Yes.
Winter would say,
Mhm.
and that it's falling back on all of that too. So that's just been weird and new and interesting.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, and I love that your quip was like, "This is my moment of therapy," because then we can actually do this in vivo, right? Like, how does this work? I will say, just as a background, is that I also spent most of my years of schooling in an evangelical school. So actually having folks invoke hell was a daily occurrence. Like it's 7:30 a.m. to 8 a.m. in chapel, and it was just talking about how we will all be going to hell. So I resonate with that very much, about the ways in which you're like, how are you saying this to me, right? And the contradictions within us, where I'm like, I thought actually this was supposed to be about love, and instead it's about,
Right.
and Catholic bashing, which was a very particular interesting strain of that, right? It's like those people are the worst types of Christians. But that's as an aside. But I say that because even in unexpected ways, again, this is why those of us who are committed to a certain type of politics, it's those moments of friction and contradiction that you're talking about. Like, you have a podcast called Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. Your politics are not, secret to anybody. And yet you have these moments, right? You're an abolitionist. You have these moments where internally you reach to these things that maybe at one point you thought you had worked through or undid from yourself, right? And for important reasons, not just pedantically because you're just a pedantic atheist, but because the ways in which these things saturate our world actually are heavily involved in the punitive and disciplinary actions of the state, and it makes sense, right? So that moment of friction that you see within yourself, to me, is actually one of the most important moments for us to be attuned to how ideology, right, and state-making practices actually come to live within inside of us psychologically. And so rather than like the rushing in to shame ourselves, like, how am I even thinking about this as an abolitionist? Or to just like shut it down and just be like, no, it's that moment. And this is why I think I have gravitated towards psychoanalysis, and not a Eurocentric psychoanalysis, but a working through and of and out of a psychoanalysis that is dedicated to an anti-oppressive praxis, right? Not the institution of psychoanalysis as it might be practiced, but rather a thinking through of theory and world making that psychoanalysis offers. Why? Because a lot of people are like, why the hell are you in psychoanalysis? And I'm like, for me, the theoretical aspects of it, if I don't stop there, which I don't because I have a political commitments, right? It's one of many tools to revolutionary futures. It's not the only one. Is to say that space, that space of contradiction, that space where things are like, how am I even thinking this, is a space of potential transformation and a space of potential emergence of what can come out of this, right? Or a recognition or acknowledgement of these pockets within us that on a daily basis, we might not be attuning to and thinking they're actually working on us. But I want to say this, what a gift from your psyche to be like, hey, this shit is still working on you. And that allows us also then to attune and say, what are the commitments to disrupting this, right? Not as a pedantic way, but because we understand that it works in service of coloniality, because this type of master narrative, right, stabilizes coloniality by having us believe that hierarchies are natural, that there are things that are ultimate good and ultimate evil, that we don't have people power, that all this stuff that we're doing just because states and people in power are not responding, that means nothing is actually happening, and we need this larger force, right, to come in on and weigh in on things. And also it helps us understand in those moments of like, what am I actually reaching to in this, right? I mean, we live in a world saturated by Hollywood movies and scripts and all of that say we must identify with the good. And we can get into that about all the like the psyops that does, and also the dishonesty when people can't get behind quote unquote liberation struggles, where like that's literally all you do is look and deify people who have to make these difficult choices in these certain spaces. But those are contours that are understood, because those are contours that are given to you and practiced over and over and over and over again by normativity and by ideology, of course. But that's what I'm playing on, is in that moment, can we think and say, my impulse is what here? What is it that I'm searching for, right? And are there other ways of doing that don't implicate or call in these otherwise oppressive forces? Are there other ways to, like what you and I are doing here, are there other ways to connect communally? Are there other ways to get me out of my isolation? Is that what's being broadcast to me, that I feel isolated and small and so utterly devastated by the injustices that I am seeing, and my mind can't wrap itself around how an injustice of this magnitude can be happening, and how nothing I have been taught to believe in will stand up to this, and the sheer disappointment we have in the people that we thought might and don't, right? It's attuning to that affect. I'm even feeling here, you and me are feeling that affect.
Yeah.
Can we transmute it into, okay, listen to the input and then search for other ways to do that? That's the insurrectionist part of this, is not letting it stop there, right? And say, how else? What else can we do? You know?
Yeah. And it makes, as you're talking about that, it draws on a little bit of work that I've done around abolition and spirituality. I wrote a piece in I have it in this book, and really, like, in it, what I was grappling with is, I mean, I've told this story before, but it started because Jailhouse Lawyers Speak had Sundiata Jawanza in particular, I can say that now because he's public with himself, that we had conversations about, like, what is it that actually calls people to resist? You know, what is it that actually, how do people draw their motivation? And particularly, we were thinking about it within the prison context, because it was coming out of the 2018 prison strike, and just thinking forward, and so we wanted to actually kind of do a little bit of an investigation into folks like Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Harriet Tubman. We could talk about the Haitian Revolution and so on, right? And there was always David Walker. There's always this deep spiritual grounding, but the grounding often, in the way that we are told these stories, it sort of becomes like, well, they're a mixture of Christian themes here, and then they're crazy, right? Like the same thing with John Brown. Like it's like it's madness and like a little bit of Christianity. And the reality is that there's a lot, when you dig into it, of African spirituality that was at the base of all of this, including Islam. And that, because by the time, for folks don't, by the time enslaved Africans were kidnapped and brought here, of course, there were Arab folks in that had brought Muslim traditions and so on into different parts of Africa, and it was within different ethnic groups within Africa at that time too. So all of those religions were there, and sometimes it gets like very kind of consolidated into like one tradition or another when it's a lot of them.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
but the point was that this has been brought up for me again. I mean, when you see Palestinian resistance, and we can show some of those clips as well. I know we want to look at some of that, but that like there's a deep, like they've taken. So the impulse that I have of saying like God needs to come in and do this, they're like, no, like God is gonna move through me in this. Like
Mhm,
I'm gonna
mhm.
be the vessel, and like it's not my tradition, right? It's not but like you can see the power, and historically it's true,
Right.
of the power that has for people resisting across all kinds of, I mean, also we could talk about the European tradition this way too, in not good ways, but like
Exactly.
in terms of in terms of wars of colonialism and the
Right.
crusades and all of that kind of stuff.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's not necessarily something that I want to um totally like valorize or fetishize, but I do want to say that it's important that we grapple with that as we think about resistance, and
Yes.
like the relationship between resistance and spirituality.
Yes.
I think is an important
Yes.
space.
Yes. And it has to be, and it has to be precisely because of what we were just talking about those places of friction as potentially transformative moments for us to understand a logic and how it works through us and how we might use it in disciplinary ways in service of the state versus in service of liberation. Right. And so I'll be a little more specific about that. I think I was at an event, and Stephen and I were speaking at an event at CUNY in December, and somebody in the audience said something that stopped me in my tracks and pushed me to really think about the mechanics of what is happening in a affective way, but also for us to reckon with these sorts of things, because of course, again, with political commitments, especially on the left, there are ways in which we might unwittingly write these things out of history about how spirituality or religion actually played a central role. And I want to say to us, like, why wouldn't it? Right? If you are in Gaza right now, what is it that we are asking people to do to disidentify from their faith or their God or any of the, and I will say any of the myth making that might do? What is the impulse in us, and where does that come from? To ask people to disidentify from that, to make them more palatable to us in particular ways, right? And so what one of the people who, the attendees of this event said was, and she located herself as a secular Muslim who in the space of her own country would not be saying the takbir, Allahu Akbar, because that is the political nature of that is different. But attending to the exhilaration she felt when in the middle of Times Square, thousands of people are responding to the takbir,
Yeah.
right? And part of that moment for me, like it pushes me, because as somebody who might not, right, who I won't say might not, but who doesn't on a regular day think about it in those terms or identify myself in that way, but to say what is happening here that's actually really important for us to attend to and read as a particular logic. And because it's contextual, to say, number one, that this is, I see a lot of people trying to back away from it, right? It's not about Islam, it's not about this, and in many ways it's not, but but what if it were? Right? If you are making it about that, like, what are the myths that we are okay getting behind, right? A settler colonial myth of whether it's manifest destiny or like we were talking about, or claims to a land, that somehow is a little bit more, we're able to digest that a little bit easier. And so we have to come to terms also with our own, right, whether it's Islamophobia or and atheists have this, right? Like Stephen wrote a book called Islamophobia, and he was discussing how there, you know, even within atheism, there's the Muslim is that much more dangerous than anybody else, which tells us about a logic, again, of oppression and the dangerousness, and where does that come? That's what I mean about the moments of friction, is for us to contend with that. What does it mean in the belly of empire, post 9/11, when we have been asked, actually demanded, to disidentify from Islam as a whole, right? To have somebody do the takbir in Times Square, right? And that we need to take that seriously about why that exhilaration, like she was able to name a desire to come together communally and say, fuck you, where did this get us? Where did your algorithm or equation of us disidentifying from Islam get us, right? The promises of just becoming American, what did that do for anybody? You've destroyed the world with your imperialism. You've entirely decimated what is called the Middle East. You've created refugees beyond what we could have even imagined. You've added to climate catastrophe in a way that is unimaginable, right? That is part and parcel of the ask to disidentify, right? And so that is part of what, for us in those moments, to say, I'm being asked to do something. And the question for us is not about whether or not you become Muslim, right? Or work out all those contradictions in that, but rather to say, in this ask, in me joining in affectively, right? In distancing myself, what am I stabilizing? And for whom am I stabilizing this? And those are the psychic contradictions that we need to be clear about, and we need to articulate, and we need to talk about. And that's why I'm so grateful to you that you offer your own internal world and process in doing this. And I'll say one last thing is that I think we need to be suspicious about the ways also when you talk about enslaved African folks or the ways in which, African traditions have always had spirituality, and the disruption of that as a communal practice, right? To isolate people in their places of worship, in their places of congregation, in places where, by the way, politics were also done. And in fact, a central place where politics were done, thought through, worked through, fought, struggled through. And so it's not an innocent aspect of that either, right? Like, I mean, we know this from NYPD, where they do like this mass surveillance of Muslims. This Stephen tracks as well. And they're just like, any place that Muslims congregate, including supermarkets and kindergartens, and dropping off their kids. Like and it's outward. So we have to also look at, when we're targeting these things, what is it of the state process that psychologically we're also doing the work of, right? And that's what I mean by stabilization. And that's why it feels so urgent for me to be like, let's talk about these things. Let's break them down. Let's use, my expertise, quote unquote, to give a language to people about the things they might be feeling on an everyday basis. And it might feel difficult to access or organize immediately because of how saturated our world is on an everyday, and it's on purpose. It's on purpose to keep people confused. That is alienation,
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna play. Folks, drop questions in the comments if you have them, because I don't want to monopolize all of Lara's brilliance here. But I'm gonna play a couple of. Well, let's play one clip to start, and we can keep going.
Yes.
All right.
تم اعتقالي من مستشفى الأهلي. ما عرفتش حاجة عن صورتي بالمرة. وزوجتي وولادي مرة ما عارفين وين. مش قادر أصل لهم. ساعة ما خدوني كانوا يغسلوا في المكان اللي فيه مرض وولادي. تم اعتقالي من داخل المستشفى ومكثت في السجون الإسرائيلية 45 يوما تحت التعذيب الشديد والتجويع تم الإفراج عني بالأمس، والآن أنا على رأس عملي بمستشفى يوسف النجار. 45 يوم ضرب مربطات الحديد، 45 يوم الكمامة على عيني، 45 يوم الكلمشات في رجلي. ورغم كل المأساة هذه أنا وزملاء الأطباء أكيد هم مثلي يرجعوا على عملهم. هذا واجب إنساني ولازم يؤدى. إيش ذنب الطفل هذا؟ ليش الطفل هذا ظل عيان؟ لم يناسبه.
So, I mean, this one brings up like a whole range of, affect, emotions. I mean, obviously on one level I played it because I think it's an amazing example of heroism in my view, of the steadfastness, samud, of Palestinian people, um of the doctors and all the medical folks, all the people. I mean, and I'm sure that this extends way beyond people who are professionals, all the people in Gaza who are constantly, is an everyday practice of trying to keep each other alive and, support each other in whatever ways that they can. Um, and doing it under conditions that, I can't imagine, right? I can't imagine, um, you know, being taken away from my family, not knowing if my family dies in a bombing, possibly, or if they're displaced somewhere or whatever. You just don't know. And then being taken and tortured, and, you know, God knows what that was like beyond what he describes, which is just unimaginable in itself. Um, for 45 days, blindfolded, bound, and then to come right back and say, "There are kids here." Like, I have and then the discussion of duty that you talked about earlier. Um, so yeah, I mean, just I don't know what it I'm sure it brings up things for you too. But yeah, it was something, especially around the time that we started talking about doing this. This was one that was I had just watched, I think, that morning, and I was like, "Oh gosh, I need to talk about this one." So yeah, I mean, and I guess the other thing I'd say is that, like, again, one of the things that I've grappled with, um, and this is a bigger thing, I think, but it relates, is that there's like moments where you feel your own psychological toll and mental health toll. And then you look at something like this and you're like, if he can still do this, then like I can too. But I also like, there's tricky things about how that makes you feel, because you're like, one, um, obviously, yes, like I am in relative comfort. I'm not in the direct line of fire or trauma. It is still having a psychological toll on me that I do need to be attentive to, but I don't want to also get stuck navel gazing and sitting in my room and thinking about this and not doing anything. So that's also something I wanted to bring up, because that comes to mind as well.
Yes. And I'm sure so many people, whether live here or people who are going to listen to this afterwards, have felt all of what you've just laid out, right? The push and pull that we're constantly in when we see these videos. And I've heard folks sort of tell me, it's like, I understand the importance of witness, and also how, all the layers of that. Here's what I want to say is that one of the things that I really appreciate about our conversation, Jay, and just sort of your engagement, is that I want us to remember that the affect is key here. Continuing to feel, right? To tear up, like to feel the heartbreak. And our impulse sometimes, for maybe multitude of reasons, both on the individual and the structural, is to turn away from that, or think that somehow we're being weak when we're pulled in. But I cannot underscore this enough. When we watch this video, and this was one of the ones that, for me, even, I often describe it as like a layer of my heart that I didn't know existed cracking open, right? And to be okay with that, like there is affect involved. There is, when we say there's a duty, when people, that doesn't mean there aren't layers of pain and injustice and fear and horror. And also there's a political commitment to life. You feeling that affect, when we watch, especially in the dangers of being bombarded by what could be, like you said, fetishizing it into inspiration porn or jadedness, our ability to still feel is central to the act of solidarity and central to the act of life making. Because part of what systems of oppression do is insist on creating deathscapes, right? And Nadira Shadhub speaks about this all the time, but it is an economy. She calls it an economy of death. We can think about necropolitics, of course, but it invites us into thinking that everything is just death and dying and all that. And yet we are seeing actively through our own affect and through what folks on the ground are showing is political commitment. I want to say this, it's a political commitment to life making and resisting and refusing erasure, right? So that is the part, both in terms of our process of feeling that affect, lean into it, folks, but also seeing him in his affect. There's something so deeply important about that does a lot of things for me that I need to name. That one thing that Gaza has done is also entirely blow the lid off of reductionistic white feminist discourses about racialized men, and in this case, particularly Palestinian and Arab men. The acts of love and care and tenderness and affect that we have seen every single day should stop us in our tracks every time we take in that wholesale. The fact that we're even surprised, and I know many people are surprised when they see this, even if you can't connect to that or you're ashamed of it, is rather than succumb to that shame, is recognize that place of friction we've been talking about why are you surprised when you see, right, an Arab or Palestinian man crying? That is important because even through his tears, and he stops himself, and he's a doctor, and he's signaling to us, I am a doctor, right, is also a disruption of this idea of the clinic and the street and the boundaries of that. When you have a genocide happening, it blows the lid off of all these ridiculous notions of how doctors should act and professionalism, because under these conditions, you've basically told us there is no separation between those things. That doctor is a father, is a brother, is an uncle, and is a doctor. And these things are all simultaneously happening at once. Right?
Yeah, and there's a baby crying in the background too, right? And there's like that, and that has been an affective kind of component of a lot of these videos we've had from doctors and nurses and so on, is that like it isn't possible for them to contain the trauma and the violence that they're constantly working within. It is not, it's there's people starving, there's people dying, they're trying to sew people's limbs back on, like all of these things. So anyway, I mean that
and
also
there's no sanitizing that. There's no sanitizing that. And the act of sanitization of containing, like you just said, right, is also an act of stabilization. It's an act that also takes our attention to other places where, like, what does it mean to commit ourselves to the fullness of life and the relationship to death and living in conditions of oppression that have been created by a settler colonial apartheid state that's backed by Big Brother settler colonial state, will contain that fullness. And that fullness is what I saw. That is why that ripped my heart open another layer. And I welcome that. I welcome those layers, because those layers are also what continue to commit us, right, to a political project that says we need to be attuned to the source of this psychological oppression, right? Not just this moment of individual, but to recognize it as a symptom of a larger structure. There is no way that video can come to our attention without a structure that makes the conditions possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pull up a comment a couple of questions from folks in the audience, and I'll, if we have time, I'll go back to some more of mine. But so Joe, hello Joe, long time, I haven't talked to you in a bit, but I know Joe. Shout out to Joe. So this was a question, and then some folks in the chat were referencing, that there are good therapists out there. There are anti-colonial therapists. So I wanted to bring this to you because I know this is in particular something that obviously you do, but it's also, a lot of people, and you may know, resources or ways that folks can connect. I'm sure everybody is very overwhelmed right now in this field, but also I think that this is something a lot of people wonder or worry about, because people do, go to therapy, counseling, etc., and it does the thing that we've talked with you and Stephen about before, of like, their basically job is just to try to bandage you back up so you get back in that workplace and have your labor exploited, and
Right.
do everything, do what
Right.
the state wants you to, all that kind of stuff. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. Assimilation, which is
Right.
which is part of like Fanon's project, which sort of speak against that, right? And he has, I'm paraphrasing here, but he has like psychiatry should be less concerned with the project of assimilation and more concerned with revolution. And revolution in terms of like, that is our job to constantly agitate and remember what the conditions that created the suffering are to begin with. But if you prescribe assimilation through patching up symptoms, you're never actually attending to that, right? So thank you for that question. And I'll say a couple things, is that number one, to echo what everybody's saying, there are incredible therapists out there doing this work, reading Fanon and so many others. I don't want to just leave it at Fanon, right? Like there are feminist practitioners that learn in the model, as I do, of Black feminist therapies that have always attended to this, and that get written out of the story of mainstream psychology, not by chance, by the way, right? So what I would say is this, is one, be clear that when you are working with a therapist or looking for a therapist, that there is nothing that's prescribed by our profession, that people need to be neutral about these things. You will be told by some folks that they cannot tell you what their position on certain things that are central to your being, whether that's an identity issue or a political issue, that there is nothing that is codified by a profession that says a therapist cannot be upfront about where they are about these things. And instead, the hiding behind neutrality is one of the ways that this, that violence sort of can happen. So I want to say that, and that's the progress, that perhaps it's also a way of how we orient ourselves to the work of therapists and what they should be doing. I don't think anybody, if they're taking their ethics seriously, can be silent about these issues. And that's actually the ask also from Palestinian clinicians, is like, do you need to be talking about these things, right? The other thing that I'll say, Joe, right? It was Joe who asked the question. Just want to make sure I got your name correct, is that progress also can't just live within the confines of the clinic. And I think this is one of the most imperious things that our profession has done, is say that the only place that therapeutic work and progress happens is within the confines of our the walls of our clinic, where we supervise. Well, what a surprise. Only in the place where your gaze is there to supervise that progress. And so when I talk about the couch, or from the clinic to the street, that I'm also disrupting the notion of where a couch lives, where this work happens, and what is involved in that. So what I regularly, talk about with folks who are just starting therapy with me, even in quote unquote setting the fee, is an idea of like, what would allow you to do things outside of therapy that sustain your soul and that still allow you to come to therapy. And that's how our fee is set. So it is also about progress, and like, what are the acts of relational and communal building that we are doing outside of that? And if it's not happening in that 45 or 50 minutes you're seeing a therapist, are there other spaces where that's being nourished that is also psychological, and in my case, what I would say, a psychoanalytic praxis, right? Some of the most radical analysts of the past would talk about the ways in which like the act of therapy or some of the most nourishing parts of therapy happened actually outside the clinic room, sometimes with therapists like literally digging holes with their patients in the context of France, for example. I'm talking here about Tiskai specifically. But really, it's also, again, us challenging this notion about where this work happens and with whom. And so the project of despecializing this knowledge is also to say, are there communal practices of healing that we're all involved in, and what is my duty also to sort of take the knowledge that was gate kept and say, here it is for public consumption, right? And to say that we are very much in this active process together. The final thing I'll say about this is there is nothing for me that has happened that feels anti-oppressive that's not rooted in relational space. And for me, it happens to have an abolitionist right sensibility to it. But, you know, the centrality of that. So if you find yourself in a clinical space that is not rooting it in the bi-directional process of building a relationship that can contend with the failures of the expert, then maybe that's the answer. Like, that's where no progress can happen.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to, let's see. Yeah, this one. I'm going to share a couple of images actually that you sent. So, and then just give you space to kind of talk about, you know, why you wanted to share these. So this is one of them. And then this one.
Yeah. And can we give credit
Yeah.
to the
Yes.
because
I will do that. Hang on.
like movement.
All right, hang on. Let me stop sharing and then I'll find out where we can get the person's tag. So it's Osh Images. So
Okay.
hang on. I can pull this up and share it this way and folks will see that.
Sure.
So there, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So this was right when this was a couple of days ago. So
Yeah.
6 days
Like
ago. Right.
About a week, yeah.
Yeah, time. I mean, it's okay, folks. If you have divested from settler colonial time as your marker of things, that's completely fine. That's what overwhelm also does. So these photos for me, I mean, there are many photos that strike me, but one of the things when you and I were talking about what are the things that sort of stick with us and what are the images that that find their way into our mind and stick with us. These two for very particular reasons. One, the sort of the imagery of the tunnel, which can't, you know, right now when all we hear is this fear-mongering around tunnels, about tunnels being the place, you know, the reason why we need to genocide people, the tunnels. For me, this photo is an act of transformation in front of our eyes. But we need to be attuned to those possibilities, just like I think I'd mentioned this in October when we spoke about just like a bulldozer transforms in front of our eyes, a bulldozer that had a very fixed meaning in the context of Palestine in front of our eyes transforms into a symbol of liberation. Instead of passively taking in these photos, what would it mean if this became the space of convergence, where we could attune, and this is what decolonial process is for me, about moving away from fixity, moving away from the fixed notions and overdetermined meanings of things as they're pumped into us. And so it's not just about like taking in carnage, it's about saying, how do these symbols that are trying to be linked up associatively, what we were talking about before, with a very particular associative process that is negative and dangerous and lurking and dehumanizing. And of course, comes to mind like, you know, of course, like a Thomas Friedman type thing where you're like talking about it in zoological terms and who lives in tunnels and right. I'm always mix these people up, so I hope that it was actually, there's so much that's
Well,
going
Thomas
on.
Friedman's terrible, so whatever,
He's,
it
I
doesn't matter.
think,
Yeah,
right.
you can lump him in with anything. Yeah, so
That's
yeah.
true. Okay, so I get a pass in terms of his ideological crassness, but this is what I mean about the practice, right? A daily political commitment to see this and go, this is also a tunnel, and look what populates that tunnel, and what does that mean for our fight? Apart from seeing kufis and Palestinian flags, for those of us who are Arabs and have been anti-Zionist through our whole life, this is why I think it gets me when people are like, none of this is working. And like, that is part of the scheme of power, is to siphon off the energy of what these symbols mean, whether it's slogans or symbols, for people who most have been cut off from them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's why I want us to be careful. Is like, seeing this is so deeply moving, both in terms of its reappropriation of the tunnel, but also about the sea of Palestinian flags, the flag that is outlawed in many countries, not the least of which is the actual indigenous land of Palestine, but also in other European countries. Having a sea of that is deeply, deeply moving. And we need to like not be cavalier about that. So that was the immediate sense of that for me. The second one is a personal one for me. As somebody who's Lebanese, as somebody who's Lebanese Arab, committed to the liberation of Palestine and to the disruption of the colonial project, the settler colonial project that has separated us as people, right? Not of our doing. And
Right.
the long history that gets forgotten, right? When we start dividing things of like, this is Palestine's problem, not is that we forget the long history of liberation fighters, both that went in across these borders freely, who were exiled into those borders, into Lebanon, who, you know, somebody like George Abdallah, who remains in prison in France, right? Because of his unwillingness to separate these flags. We could be cynical as leftists and be like, these are representations of a state project.
Right.
And listen, once liberation comes, I'll be right there with you to dismantle the state, you know, but right now is not the time. What is the history? What is the narrative? To go back to what you were saying, the importance of narrative. What is packed into that as a narrative of peoples, right? Who have always shared the knowledge of land, who have always shared what it means to be connected as a peoples. I have said this in some places. I can't remember if we talked about this when we first came on the show and talked about our book, but I will say one of the most moving things for me about going to Palestine in the process of working on the book and meeting comrades and making community and making solidarity movements was driving. A comrade clinician of ours was driving us into the state now known as Israel, and seeing the horrific alien buildings that had no place being there. They're not of the place, right? They're like colonial imports, buildings that are might look like something that's in California, for example. Right? They're just like, they're not of the aesthetic of the region in any way. So you can immediately see like, this is even an import. And looking out the window, feeling so utterly just gutted and oppressed even in that space, and looking out the window casually and seeing shrubbery that looks like the shrubbery of Lebanon, of the mountains where I'm from, and having that moment, just like with that tunnel, of saying, even under these settler colonial contours, I can see this rock. I can see this shrubbery because I'm of this place. This is what connects us. This land right? And the topography of this place connects me in ways that a settler might not even notice. They left the rock there, they left the shrubs because they're not attuned to the power of that. And in that moment, that was a reconnection to be like, these things might be alien, but there are things that actually cross these borders, which are also alien and not natural, and all these sorts of things. So again, maybe this is part of making life, right? Stephen has a new piece out in social text called Theory as Stone. And he talks about Edward Said's famous photo of throwing that stone. And part of what he talks about is that picking up the stone, the act of saying, I pick up a stone and I throw it, is also an act of insisting I'm of this land and that stone is mine to pick up. And I know what this stone is. I know the power of that, not just theoretically, but literally, materially, right? And I don't know if you bargained that all of that was packed into those photos, but I hope
did not,
it's
but that's
helpful
awesome.
in some ways.
No, it's great. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot packed into all of these things, I think, when we start to get into, get into that. Yeah. So yeah, no, that's great. The one thing I will say is the
Yeah.
tunnel part specifically for me, I had the same, not, and you didn't say this to me, I was like, gosh, there's a way that this kind of looks like the tunnels, right? That people keep talking about, in Gaza. And so, yeah. All right. So let's see where to go from here. I think I'm gonna go actually jump ahead a little bit, and we might come back to some other things. But some folks have asked about. I'll bring it in connection to something that someone asked,
Okay, yeah.
so we can kind of
Love to hear
blend
from
in.
folks.
So, let's see. So this was one. What are your thoughts on staying mindful of not diluting or erasing commitment and support of Palestinian resistance while also practicing therapeutic resistance across the diasporas? Love what you had to say about combating psychic intrusions. And I also hear others put resistance in the self-care blender. So that's we'll keep that question top of mind, and I can pull it back up later if you want to look at it when you respond. But I'm gonna pull a resistance video because I think one of the things that I said this to you is that I mean, one, like I share a lot of this stuff. I retweet a lot. And I mean, even from the very beginning, especially as things, as the bombing campaigns became so intense and everything else, um, these videos definitely played a strong psychological, like, kind of balancing role for me, honestly, and like I would look for them. I needed them. I needed to see examples of people resisting, yeah, I mean, we can get into why a little bit. I'll show the video before I go further on that. Let's see, is it this one? Yeah, let's do this one. Okay, it's replaying. So that was the video there. And then there's one. I'll go ahead and show one more so that way we can talk about both of them. Sorry. Tech stuff.
Give folks time to sit with what you just showed.
Yeah. All right. I think it's this one. Okay.
من بين يديهم شدة ومن خلفهم سدة فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون.
All right. So, I mean, I've talked to so many people about this stuff. I've talked to my mother about it. I mean, like, what? So, first of all, I'll say this. I'll say that, you know, one of the things that's quite clear to me, because I want to say this because a lot of folks who identify as abolitionists may or may not feel the same way that I do about this, which is like it's very clear to me that this is necessary, that resistance is and this form, being able to disable tanks, being able to um, you know confront these Iron Dome systems and all of the array of violence, weaponry, surveillance, um, drones, etc., that people live under in Palestine, that there isn't a way that we can just kumbaya this shit away. Like it is not, I it's quite clear to me that that there's a long history of nonviolent resistance and all other kinds of things, and those things still are ongoing in different ways. I would argue that the doctor is a form of nonviolent resistance in a certain way, right? And that there's all kinds of ways that liberation struggles take. However, there is a military reality, right, that has to be confronted, and there's something just amazing about the way that it makes you feel, again thinking about affect, of somebody going, and I mean there's hundreds of these videos at this point online now, but of like taking an explosive and like hand sticking it onto the tank and then running back and then shooting the rocket at it to explode it, going back and picking up the piece, a piece of the exploded tank. The young man with the gasoline canister with maybe an IUD or whatever, like connected to it. Um, and there's this like trajectory within Palestinian resistance of like, how many years ago were they throwing rocks? How many, and then like the individual gun that groups of militants were sharing for a while and taking back and forth, and the attempt at one point, I think there were like balloons that they were trying to make that we were filling with gasoline or whatever. And so there's all of these, it's a long project of and I've talked about this with Abdul Jawad, some of like developing these tactics and trying to see what will work. Like, how do we combat these things? How do we develop something that can actually disable this military reality that we live under? But yeah, I mean, it's like, and it's funny because at some points I've shared or talked about how I felt, and I've had like, I mean, these people are probably Zionists, or if not, they are anyway.
Even if they don't think they are.
Yeah, exactly. Whether they think of themselves that way or not.
Yeah.
And they'll say, oh yeah, like you're supporting terrorism, right? As I've said, I'm like there are tanks in their neighborhoods. Like, I mean, like, and I mean, I should say, like, during 2020, there were tanks in the neighborhoods of the children that I work with in Philadelphia.
Yes.
And they had tear gas in their rooms. We had kids that, so like, it's not, I don't say that totally like completely with no sense of what the reality of that is like at all. But at the same time, at least those tanks weren't driving through and blowing up all the buildings, on 52nd Street. And the Israeli tanks are doing that. They are, killing their friends and their neighbors. And so what could be more heroic than somebody taking a can of gasoline and blowing up that tank? I mean, and again, like I'm not trying to say it's the only way or whatever, but I support that. And also
you and international law, it just happens.
Yeah, right. But it's just yeah, I don't know. I mean, that there's an interesting way that, and I know that Hamas is, and Islamic Jihad and all the groups that send out these videos, that they're conscious of this too, right? Of the psychological and affective registers that they're working on as they share these things with the world. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you wanted to share, but we could bring back up the question, because it's somewhat related, even though I know that Palestinian resistance. But anyways, yeah.
No, this is, and I really appreciate the question, and especially the follow-up of the self-care blender, right? Because it would tell you your impulse. This is where I want to sort of hone in on technique. I want to transport us into a clinician's office potentially, that it might not be aware of anti-oppressive techniques and might shy away from that in that moment where you say, I need these videos, that either there's a panic around what that means because we are asked to surveil our patients by the state, right? And in fact, in some places, actually, you have to report quote unquote potential terrorism, or it might be a worry about your mental health. And so it's veering you away from what you have articulated is actually helping you stay sane. I'm not even like getting near the content even yet, right? I'm laying bare a very common practice in technique that would say, I'm here to care for you, which is a very paternalistic care, rather than actually attune and listen to what you are saying, which there's something inside of me that needs these, it is feeling the need for these videos. And what would it mean to not have all the alarms go off inside of us for the reasons that aren't yours, by the way, but it's liability and all this other stuff, and actually attune to what you are communicating there, which is what you and I did even before, of like, what is being communicated here in that need, right? So I just want to lay that there as a response to the self-care blunder, because the self-care blunder would be like, maybe instead of this, is there anything else you can do that would help you actually, right? Calm your nerves, and maybe this is overstimulating, right? I'm using these words kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also not, because anybody who's a clinician in the room and listening has heard these words, and oftentimes these are taught also, and this is how these subjectivities of therapeutics are actually passed along as a part of the self-disciplining project, because we supervise students and we tell them that this is what they should do with people too, right? This is the self-care blender. I love that. Thank you for that self-care blender image, because rather than like you are communicating something and saying, this is my mode of self-care, and here are the reasons why. You also were very clear on that. There is no confusion there. You were like, in a world, let me link this up to the conversation we're having earlier, in a world where all justice seems to be lost. I'm ventriloquizing you here. I've lost all, right, things I could reach to that maybe prior did some semblance of work of saying this will come in and take care of this, right? You are reaching to that. To me, you are entirely aligned with reality, and you are articulating that very clearly. There is nothing off base about what you are saying, and you are internally recognize and can articulate and narrate back to narration why it is that this has a pull for you, right? What an amazing, all of us should be happy if somebody came in and did that.
It's also like, I'll just say quickly, like, it's also a recognition that Palestinians came to that conclusion a long time ago because
Yes.
they had to in order
Yes.
to develop the capacity to be able to do the things
Yes.
that they're doing now.
Yes.
Right. And so it's also in some ways, the whole last 4.5 months or so have in some ways also been a kick in the butt, I feel like, for a lot of folks
Mm.
in
Mm.
the West of saying, we need to get very serious in our movements, about kind of where we are and the sort of capabilities and capacities that will have to be developed in the long run, I
Yes.
think. And, again, it's not to say like folks need to jump to a certain form of action or anything like
Right.
that. But just saying that, like, when I look at it in the Palestinian context, it's like, oh, they understand.
Mm.
They knew that the tanks would come,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so then
Mhm.
it's a question of how do you be prepared for the tanks when the tanks
Yes.
come, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they knew because this is ongoing and living history and daily life of oppression under an apartheid settler colonial regime. In the context of Gaza, it's 17 years of a siege. People were marching nonviolently and were getting sniped and were getting shot at in the knees, right? So this idea of like surprise, why are we surprised that we are here? That's number one. I think also there's something really important about what you're saying, Jay, and this is for us to reckon with internally, right? Is on the aspect of transformation. Is one of the ways that psychic intrusions and propaganda work is to ask us as viewers to trouble and problematize why we might find joy, right? And like righteous joy. At the same time, this is the contradictions I'm talking about. At the same time that we are brought up to valorize these things in history, right? In a progressive realm, I'm not talking about
Absolutely.
right? In that we can, it's only after the fact, it's only after we sanitize, it's only after we organize, it's only after we've deemed the people to be worthy of our valorization that we can do these sorts of things after the fact. So we're in a place very fundamentally for me to say, why wouldn't you, when you have articulated, and this I'm speaking to you specifically, but maybe others who feel this, when you feel you've lost all connection to everything just in the world, why wouldn't there be a place within you that felt and said right on when indigenous people of the land, right, say, this is how we are defending our space, and this is what we choose to do to intruders, to settlers, to a state offensive, okay? This is what I mean about the transformation. We are regularly being bombarded by language of war, right? Constantly. It's not an offensive, it's a war, it's a conflict, all of that. So even when we try to strip the layers, your response even makes sense within that discourse, except you are then shamed for that response because it was a myth to begin with, that wording of that. Because if it were that, I want us to pay attention and for us to be clear, right? So that we don't get into that trap of the first video that you showed, where then it's like the psychic inversion that we were talking about, is to say, we are asked psychologically to transform that tank, right? That tank into the potential person, not soldier, who is within that. And that's the person we should be connecting to. I am not saying that within us, we should not be as ethical people saying there's right. I mean, we can, but in that moment, this is a military incursion and therefore it's a military target. And so it's also for us to be like that enjoyment is because we're seeing in guerrilla warfare against a machine that, again, let me locate this, not only has blown up, right, entire blocks and with entire disregard to the civilian population, but is actually there to go over the rubble There are humans underneath that rubble. So the ask for us to deflect our attention from the joy we might feel in people righteously resisting instead is channeled into the moralism and forgetting that the point of these tanks is very specific. And we are seeing the carnage of that. That diversion is a tactic as well, right? And so it's just to normalize, to say, of course, the final thing that I'll say that is kind of a fuck you, but I deal in fuck yous, so let's do that, is that if I am fine with people saying, what is wrong with you? You are supporting terrorism, right? If they also stop watching Marvel, if they also stop watching their cop shows, if they also stop watching their military porn, right? That would dictate that tanks can only live in certain places and do certain things to certain people. Because when you brought up that example of the tanks, right, in places where you work and with people that you work, right? The lovely analysis we were offered was, this is America, not Afghanistan. This is not Iraq. This is America, which again works on associations about where those tanks belong and where they don't. Okay, so if we are going to get into this narrative of moralizing your response to that, then let's be honest, right, about what are the things. And when we're honest, we can see that racism is a part of this, right? That we are also dictating the way people should die, not how they should live, the way they should die. And in the end, how fragile are you as an entire entity? Part of what is fascinating about these videos to me is you get to see the militants are folks who are not in gear, full gear. Sometimes they're in what we call a shahata, which is a slipper, right? Running out, knowing full well that they could be seen and murdered on the spot. And of people who know their land. All the surveillance, it shows us people, and maybe that's part of what you're attuning to as well, that it's not just about, because I reject this idea that it is just about destruction. I reject it full scale, because what you are articulating is actually far more powerful. It's an affective attunement to people's will to live. It's an affective attunement to people's connection to their land. It's an affective attunement to the rights that they have as an occupied people. It's an active attunement to people's ability to refuse intrusions and to say, I will fight to my death because this is a just cause. We need to square up with that. And there needs to be a moratorium on leftists who love the Battle of Algiers, okay, and all these things. And when then you moralize around these sorts of issues, like there's a lot of layers happening here, and us to break it down into these ways is actually helpful to keep our focus on the political project here. And for you also not to feel shame about why, I don't think you do, right? I think you're very on point, but I know that people try to activate that shame, and they try to activate it through fear mongering and all these sorts of things. Whereas like, it's actually quite simple when we look at it, and psychologically of like, there is a triumphant, right, element to that about and this is the way where all these myths we've been brought up on, suddenly people want them to stop here. That the good guys will always win, that no matter how small you are, you can beat the forces of evil and the big guys who fight against you. I mean, this is pumped into us, and then suddenly you're supposed to stop seeing that when it's actually happening, right? And instead identify with the oppressor. How does that work? But it works on these ideological streams that we're talking about.
Yeah, very much appreciate that. So I'm going to pull a couple other questions from the audience.
Yes, please.
So Susan asked, could you explain how psychoanalysis can be helpful in understanding how we internalize structures of hierarchy and oppression, specifically related to the state? I'm thinking specifically of Lacanian concepts of law and law of the father, the symbolic, etc.
What a great question. Okay, can you pull that first one up? Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah. can be helpful in understanding how we internalize structures of hierarchy and oppression. Okay. I won't speak to psychoanalysis, like mainstream psychoanalysis. Maybe it's easier for me to speak to how I have found psychoanalysis helpful to understand these sorts of things. That in many ways, the theory itself lends us a language and a discourse around how contradictions can exist psychically and people work to stabilize them and be able to function, right? Those things can look many different ways. One of them might be these rules of hierarchy, like the law of the father, the law of hierarchy. Now we can look at that and also say how that stabilizes a particular type of social reproduction, right? And we identify with these things. So we identify with them as fixtures, as universal fixtures. In one way, psychoanalysis offers a language to normalize that, by the way. This is that's what I'm a critic of, is that psychoanalysis also has a discourse that would normalize that and say the hierarchies, whether it's Oedipus or the law of the father or any one of these things, is that this is just the way that psychically we are going to be organized, and that everything that people do is a way to recreate that and recapitulate these structures because they are normative fixtures of the world. And we can start to see also how that might tie into issues of race and gender, and like everything is a detraction from the norm, right? My dear friends Avisa Cthulhu and Pellegrini have a book called Gender Without Identity, and they talk about the ways in which it's only talked about, gender is only talked about as a sort of breaking off from the norm when it has to do with trans or non-binary identity, but we never talk about gender en masse as something that is fluid and in constant motion that could go in either direction. But when we mark transness as different, then we are then saying there's an actual standard that we would like to return people to, right? And that's a confession. I think that's it. So in some ways, even critiquing normative psychoanalysis helps me understand the reasons why we identify with hierarchies. They help organize us psychically. But also I want to say that the psychic work is done mutually and sort of bidirectionally by state projects, whether that's state projects of religion or education or ideology, right? Or capitalism, right? Imagine what it would, and this is where psychoanalysis helps me, is like, why is it that people might identify with structures of hierarchy against their own benefit it's not benefiting them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a way in which our internal world comes to be structured by that as well. And we have investments in it. We have investments in hierarchies, and we have investments in power, and we have investments in the way, and it can come down in articulations of like trickle down theory, like somehow I'm going to get some of this, but also those investments are racial, right? And they have to do with class power, and they have to do with identifications with what power will provide us. And so the psychoanalysis that helps me is one that offers me tools to explain the logic that repeats itself, right? Is if we were to sort of open it up and say, what is the logic this follows? And how does this logic include psychic contradictions? Because I am symptomatic here. Some of us would be like, if I'm symptomatic, wouldn't I just do something else? Well, it's a little more complicated than that, because these hierarchies have been woven into the way that we experience the world and the way that our own functioning and safety in the world sometimes is also involved. And so I hope that helps a little bit, but I think the main takeaway I will say is that these theories are not universal theories, and yet they're sold as though they are. And I think that's the most dangerous aspect of that. And why I'm a critic of psychoanalysis in these ways, because it's almost like people believe in the theory and then they run into a wall of believing their own theory. Because if you believed your own theory of contradictions and the unconscious and ways in which we act in ways that might not be readily available to us, and we have we're primed to connect to people affectively in ways that might reproduce hierarchies and all those sorts of things, because we're taught that's the way, that you live well, and that's the way that you flourish, and that's the way that you, don't get killed, even in the most basic terms, right? but those are not universal principles, and they're certainly not neutral, and they're certainly not they're certainly not political, as is often talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So I'm gonna pull up one other question here, and then
Sure.
there's something else that maybe I'll add on to it, that because I know that we're getting close to, we'll probably wrap up in a few minutes here.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for all of this today. But there, one of the things that we do want to make sure that we're doing right is encouraging people, as you sort of said at the outset of, we've talked about with the self-care blender of, how do we leverage a kind of a therapeutic or a psychological register where it keeps us going, that sustains us, rather than us getting burnt out and secluded and all of those things. So that's one question. I think it's somewhat related to this, although I'll let you answer them separately if you would like to. But the question is, how did Fanon manage to stay sane in French genocide in Algiers, and the rest of the colonies around the world? And I think, if I read your work correctly around Fanon, it's the connection to resistance as well, as it is as part of what you bring up within the Palestinian context in your book, is that the only thing that can really deal with the level of psychological torment, and that is just the status quo, is through resistance. And so
yes, the most canned answer is he joined the revolution, which literally he did. And it got to the point where he was just like, part of the commitment to join the Algerian revolution was his recognition that there was no way he could truly say, as a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, that he was committed to the alleviation of suffering if he was just on the sidelines of a revolution that was happening, that had a righteous cause. And he, one of the things I do in seminars or when I'm sort of teaching Fanon is we read his clinical papers next to his political treaties. And it shows us just how that process was actually intimately, intertwined, and which is why we see this right-wing discourse of people being like Fanon as, the most evil thing you could read, or decolonization as, wanting to wipe out people, is because there's a resonance there about him sort of being like, these are the reasons why we need to get behind the revolution, because there are questions of psychic health that are also being worked out in these spaces. His most famous, one of the best chapters, I think, for me, when we think about these things is in the Algerian family, right? The chapter of Algerian family. And he talks about how revolution and people's militancy actually transforms the family, transforms relationality, transforms hierarchies, to go back to the question before that. And people have to start making decisions about, do I serve my individual or sort of nuclear family in the ways in which that might replicate oppressive structures? Or am I committed to revolution and transformation? And am I committed to being an active participant in that? And he talks about in that, this is in the Dying Colonialism, by the way, I didn't mention that, where he says, people are not passive in this. Everybody has an active role. And maybe the active role is not as we imagine it to be. And maybe this speaks to the ableism or the aesthetic of militancy, is that it's not all in the fighting. There are multiple pieces that are happening all the time, but where they join is in a commitment to transforming and creating a different world. And that transformation is constantly in emergence. Maybe that's the abolitionist part of it, right? Is that it's not a foregone conclusion about what that looks like. It's an active participation of people saying, this is what we want it to look like. So again, the canned response, he joined the revolution, and he writes about that. He's like, there is nothing that I could have done. More concretely, what he did as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst is that he divested from institutions. There's a very famous letter in which he writes the French sort of official, and resigns his position and says, I'm resigning my position because your institution stabilizes colonial power and violence, and I cannot be involved in this. And so that's a question to us as clinicians and mental health professionals of where are the spaces that we have to divest from. We cannot expect us to be actively engaged in the making of a new world and staying within positions, whether it's on listservs or organizations or in individual conversations or in the way we practice, and have it be the same way. If your practice has been unchanged, you are stabilizing the colonial project and the imperial project. There's nothing disruptive about that. And what the modes of disruption look like have different ways of showing up, right? I mean, my dear sisters and comrades in the struggle in the UK, whether that's Robert Downes or Gail Lewis or Feluke Taylor, talk about Black feminist processes, right? And how being in communal space and struggle and making Black feminist living room together is a way that we might disrupt these processes. And that is what I mean by it can look differently. But to get it right is like staying sane means being clear that there is a violence happening, and being clear also to our commitments and our political duty, wajib, right? To speak to these things and disrupt them and use ourselves as an agent of mutative change. What's the point of all these expertise if we're not doing that? What I will say about Fanon is he became a gun runner. Right? And I'm not saying everybody needs to be a gun runner, but if we can use that, there we go. And part of the reason why he was a gun runner, where he knew, and he articulates this, he was just like, nobody's going to suspect me. I can do this work because nobody can suspect me in these ways for all these reasons, right? I'm a professional, I'm all these sorts of things. So what is our parallel to that, right? Most of us are not going to become gun runners. But what is our parallel to that? If we can say that his commitment to Irvin was to say, I need to use the power that I have in this particular way and commit to the vision of the indigenous people who are fighting a colonial power, what is our parallel to that? And what do we need to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I'm going to wrap it there, and maybe we can do a part 2 at some point, because I know there's some stuff that we didn't get to. I don't know. Do you want to do Basil's rules, or should we save that for another one?
Let's
I
do
feel like
part 2. Yeah.
Okay,
I
we'll
feel
do a
like
part
that, Basil Al-Araj's, commitments feel like they need
more space.
do
Yeah, I don't want to try
justice.
to. Yeah, absolutely. So that's great. So we'll do a part 2. We'll set that up. Thank you so much for this. This was wonderful for me. And I hope that folks who are watching, I think a lot of good comments in the chat. So, thanks for everybody coming through and watching and participating as well.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for your labor and everything that you're doing. It's very appreciated.
Same to you also. I mean, I know that you are doing a whole lot right now, and it's appreciated as well. So thank you.